Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Like Joe said, the title of the talk today is Understanding Patterns of Fish Kill Events in Minnesota and Wisconsin lakes. Give you some perspective on the work that we've been doing over the last few years and some recent hot off the press data that I'm excited to share with all of you. I'll begin first with the acknowledgements. The more recent collaboration that we'll be talking about towards the end of the presentation is includes the gentlemen listed here. Simon and Adam are both at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Andrew's at the University of California, Davis. And Samuel and Andrew Bray are at Reed's College out west. So this is a great team that's coming together to work on this topic of fish kills in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I'll also be referencing, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these two papers that sort of instigated this collaboration. One published here in 2019 for Minnesota fish kills, and one focused on Wisconsin fish kills, published just a few months later in 2019. But I'll have these citations later in the talk too, if you want to follow up with more details about the specific work and the data that informs it. But I want to begin with this overarching question of how will global climate change impact the health of fish in Midwest glacial lakes? Now, we all have some guesses probably coming into a talk like this, but there are, as far as I see it, three possible scenarios for the fish in this region, or animals anywhere for that matter. The first option that they have is to move. If they don't like it where they are, they can move somewhere else. And as you could guess, that's quite a bit of a challenge for fish in lakes, although there are management discussions that could assist that migration through changes in stocking programs that might support a more warm water population versus a cool water population. The second scenario is that the fish could adapt to climate change. It's possible that they just grow to smaller sizes to better utilize oxygen, lower oxygen levels in warmer water conditions. But I think many would argue that the rate of environmental change that we're experiencing right now probably outpaces most fish populations' ability to adapt or evolve their way through this. So we're likely going to see some challenges with that scenario too. The third scenario is that the fish could die, either move, adapt, or die. And that last scenario is one that I'm going to spend the remainder of the talk focusing on. Clearly, as water temperatures warm, all animals, all living things will eventually get pushed to their thermal maximum. And it's at that threshold where bad things can happen. And this is playing out at local and global scales. And just to give you some perspective from a paper published in PNAS in 2015, they documented across taxa that mass mortality events are on the rise over the decades. This happens both in the number of events that occur and also the number of individuals that are dying in those events. And you can see some variability between organismal groups here, and part of that's related to the type of data that's informing it, but nevertheless, you see some trend lines that aren't going in very great directions. And if we focus in here on fish, what we're working mostly on, you can see that the trends are in the positive direction, that over time there are more fish kills and that the number of fish dying are also going up. Now, there are many reasons for these fish kill events, in that the Fay paper in 2015 breaks it down if you're curious to learn more, and it includes anthropogenic factors like chemical spills, it includes starvation, it includes a bunch of abiotic and biotic factors that can drive those events. What we're seeing here in this region are a whole mix of all of those scenarios, and those associated with increasing water temperature are the most startling. There are, again, clear direct impacts with hot water, and mortality, but there's also the indirect factors that can affect fish health and stress in other ways. For example, warm water will increase the likelihood of algae blooms. Algae blooms, when they die, they decrease oxygen, and the fish can die from lack of O2. Not necessarily direct impact of the temperature, but some contributing factor along the way. Infectious diseases like columnaris can also be a much bigger problem as water temperatures rise and cause these indirect mortality events. I'm not going to focus as much for the purpose of this presentation on things like chemical spills, toxins in the environment, runoff, and infectious diseases that may not have as much of a temperature driving influence, but they do exist, and the fish are struggling with lots of problems out there, not just the temperature ones. Just to orient us all, though, I'm using the term fish kill and mass mortality event, and I'll use it quite a few times throughout the presentation, but I want to just define it in the way I see it anyways. And there's lots of definitions out there, but the main point is that it's a localized die-off of the same or similar species with similar clinical signs at the same point in time. Now, the number of individuals that die, that's often where these definitions can be variable and perhaps some subjectivity there. Now you have two pictures here, one just a handful of fish and one with thousands. I have a fairly low bar for my threshold for defining a fish kill. Maybe 5 bluegill or 5 carp aren't a meaningful number, but 5 muskie or 5 sturgeon would be. So setting the bar low like this sort of opens the door to more data, more investigations, and perhaps identification of trends that would otherwise be missed. Now, I've got a few slides just to explain why we should be investigating fish kills before I go into the data and the research that we've been doing. I think it's important to investigate fish kills to prepare and identify and respond to new threats. In the last 10 years or so, my lab has found dozens of novel and emerging pathogens as a result of investigating fish kill events in dead fish. There are things out there. The more you look, the more you're going to find. And to give you an example here from the Great Lakes region that you're probably familiar with, back in about 2005 to 2010, there were large prolific fish kills in the Great Lakes Basin. The result of the viral hemorrhagic septicemia virus breaking out. Now, everyone paid attention as that was playing out, but in the freezer, we found later that there was an archive sample where that virus was detected, was collected from a fish kill event, put in the freezer, and never confirmed. And it was only after the fact that we learned that this virus had been out there at least several years before killing fish, and the phylogenetics suggested that it's been there for a couple of decades, likely causing low-level mortality events along the way before we realized what was going on. So investigating these fish kills to look for those new things can be really important. It's also, there's value in looking at fish kills, thinking about making your haystack smaller. If you want to know what bad things are happening on the landscape, you look at where bad things are actually happening. You look at fish kills. Most management fish health programs look at asymptomatic individuals for known threats. And that's fine, and there's reasons for doing that, but I'd argue that looking for fish kills, a syndromic surveillance approach makes a lot of sense too. Identifying trends over time is particularly relevant to this idea of warming water and population shifts. You see reports like this that hot weather is likely contributing to fish die-offs, but when you look back in the published literature, it's fairly sparse, especially in this region, as to what's actually happening. And when management decisions are being made to create these refuge lakes and other sorts of stocking programs, it's important that the fish health and mortality events are considered as part of those practices. And if we don't investigate the fish kills, if we aren't tracking that data, we're making management decisions in the dark. There's also public concern for the managers in the audience. You've probably all received one of these calls, usually on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. But as fish start to die, the public take note, especially when the mortality events are large. And you can just see just a smattering here of news headlines of the media paying attention, then the public does too. And if we aren't investigating them and it's left to linger, you get reports like this, not from our region, but down in Arkansas, where apparently UFOs are found hovering over this fish kill event. And despite my couple decades in the field of fish health, I've never come across a mark of the alien found on dead fish. So the creativity that can transpire when we're not investigating these things can lead to problems. And lastly, advancing science of fish health in fisheries management is critically important and central to the work of probably everybody on this call. And fish kills and understanding what drives them is an important component of that. So if nothing else, I encourage you from the scientific perspective in making informed decisions here that we need to understand what's going on. Now, this all sounds good, and hopefully you're convinced. I'm not unaware of the challenges, though, of investigating fish kills. There are a lot. I've heard them all. I'm talking about fish kills for quite a while, and I've heard all the reasons why we can't do it. Standardization, there's too many people, there's not enough money or capacity. It's just not a priority, frankly, for some folks. They all exist. These are things that we shouldn't be deterred by, and I encourage all of us to work through these challenges to move the ball forward in productive ways. So hopefully I've given you a sense that investigating fish kills are important, and despite these challenges, it's something we ought to do. But where do we begin with all of this? The unpredictability of these events in both space and time has really challenged us. So sort of getting our hands around this has been an issue, and something that's only recently been looked at here in this region. So like most good things, let's start with Minnesota. And I'll first talk about the Minnesota case study, then I'll go into Wisconsin second. But here in Minnesota, we are blessed with abundant natural resources. We've got a lot of lakes, and fortunately we have a highly engaged public. We've got high caliber management agencies and researchers who are all out there to help support and protect our fish populations. And we're really proud of what we have here in the state. But something that we don't talk a lot about are the threats to our fisheries. And we're not immune to the challenges here in Minnesota. And perhaps in the back of this picture with the old Governor Wendell Anderson, we could have a fish kill going on in today's day and age. So with this sort of background chatter and anecdotal reports that fish kills are on the rise, we worked with a group at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources to better understand sort of retrospectively, just organize data and do some descriptive statistics just to see what's happening as a way to inform our future approaches. So very briefly, we collected and organized data from two of many databases here in the state, one from the DNR's pathology lab and also from their spills and kills book, a handwritten ledger of mass mortality events of various animal species kept at the DNR. So we got all that information from the years of 2003 to 2013, organized it just, and I'll show you some different figures here that just give you a sense of what we saw in these data. First, the number of fish kills. You can see it varies by year. We did not look at why there was this variability, but we'll come to that later in this presentation. You'll see a spike though in 2005, 2007, perhaps not coincidentally related to the VHS virus in the Eastern Great Lakes. Now we've never diagnosed VHS here in Minnesota, but there was a lot of awareness for fish kills and people paying attention, especially managers. So the idea of reporting what they saw was elevated, and this is just a guess retrospectively. Perhaps there was other drivers here too, but that's sort of a peak of note over time. If we look at the various fish families that were afflicted during these kills, dominated by Centrarchidae, sunfish, crappies, predominantly some largemouth bass as well. You can see various other families in there too. Saprinid is the second one. I shared these descriptive statistics with a group of managers in a presentation, and their sense was that the makeup of the proportional makeup of the fish families looked to be about right from their professional experience, but what's surprising was how few fish kills were actually being reported. So you can see here the numbers vary between 10 and 41 over the course of this study, but we estimated through those conversations that approximately 500 fish kills are happening each year in Minnesota. So about 8% or so are actually making it into a database. The vast majority are noted by managers, but not actually documented. Over time, you can see a dramatic peak in the warm summer months, attributed in the database to things like hot summer temperatures, spawning stress, things like that. Just spatially, to give you a sense on these figures, the red triangles are where the fish kills are reported. On the left, there was no correlation with the number of lakes in any given county. However, there was strong correlation with population density. Now, this might indicate that there are human influences here in the mortality events, or that there's observational bias in where the people are. They just see more fish kills and are likely to report it. The factors that are associated with these kills, largely environmentally driven, or at least this is what is written down in those databases. The person who observes it or investigates it says that it's an environmental factor, like low oxygen or spawning stress because of warm water, things like that. Infectious disease was number 2, almost always indicated that it was columnaris. Although there are very few that are actually confirmed in the laboratory setting. About a quarter of the fish kills were unknown. They were never diagnosed or even a guess made. About 10% just left that sort of spot in the report blank, so there's no information on a possible cause, and 10% were associated with chemical spills, perhaps a higher number than you might normally expect, given that this is the primary purpose of one of these databases was to document spill events. So it's not surprising that that number is pretty high. So if I'm going to Vegas with $100, making a guess on where we would likely see a fish kill in the future, it's probably in Minnesota. It's probably going to be in sunfish or crappie in June, likely attributed to warm water or columnaris near an urban area. Just really briefly, we wanted to look at some predictive models here to see if we could understand where things are happening on the landscape and may occur in the future. So we use the ecological niche modeling, use MaxScent. It's a spatial autocorrelation algorithm that allows for negative reports. So if we don't have data, that's okay. And in this case, that's pretty important for fish kills where no observations might not mean no fish kill. So long story short there, we created this, the model, some of the predictive factors that were significantly influencing how this played out, the maximum overnight temperature, cropland nighttime light index, and population density. So a couple of metrics there for agricultural land use and urbanization. Now, this isn't perfect and it's a bit biased by the types of data that went into it, but it is a good starting point for monitoring trends over time. If from a study like this, we start to see an increased number in, I don't know, Cisco mortalities, that might be a deviation from what already exists and important to pay attention to. So meanwhile, over in Wisconsin, I mean, they've got a fair number of lakes themselves, and they, like Minnesota, are not immune to stressors on those fish populations. Back in 2004, the Wisconsin DNR, from what I understand, was starting to pay more attention to fish kills and created their own database to monitor these events over time. And this paper, published by Till and others in 2019, looked at that database from 2004 to 2014, looked at all of the documented fish kill events that occurred across 379 lakes, and looked for trends, very similar to what we did in Minnesota, coincidentally timed. So what they saw, like what we saw in the Minnesota database, is the fish kills were dominated by syncharchids during the hot summer months. 61% of those fish kills were attributed to infectious disease and summer kill, hot water temperatures. You can see on the right-hand side, the red dots are where the fish kills were happening. Ignore the blue dots for now. I'm going to come back to this figure in a minute, but just to give you a sense of the spatial distribution of where those events occurred. And you can see the breakdown here of the various causes for those fish kill events in Wisconsin over those 11 years. And you can see a big chunk related to infectious disease in warm water temperatures in the summer. Well, they had some really interesting figures, and I encourage you to check this paper out if you're curious on the specifics. What they noted were strong or significant increases in water temperature in fish kill events compared to places where there were not fish kills. So the warmer the water, especially compared to average, you're more likely to get a fish kill. Now, that was not true for infectious diseases. These are the two categories they broke out in this figure here on the left. And there was no trends for the relationship between temperature and fish kills in the wintertime. Importantly, and where I think this paper did an amazing job, is started to look at that future forecasting under future climate scenarios. We did not do this for the Minnesota data set, and it's startling here what they observed in Wisconsin. So just to orient you here, on the y-axis, you have the total number of predicted summer kill events. They focused on the summertime events, given the previous slide, and showing that there was a strong temperature driver there. On the bottom, you can see the annual temperature projections, so the 8.5 model forecasts, the more extreme model forecasts. I'll take away these boxes here, and you'll see on this first historical context the number of fish kills that had happened, documented in their database over that 11-year period. By mid-century, they forecasted a doubling of the number of fish kills that would be expected given an increase in water temperature. And by the end of the century, 4 times as many fish kill events than what was being observed at the turn of the century. So this is a pretty dramatic increase, and keep in mind these numbers on the left are those that were observed. The actual number of fish kills, if you assume that there's underreporting, could be quite dramatic. And this increase over time is something that is of note, of course, to managers and the public alike. Spatially, you can see these trends play out over time. The redder the dots in panels B and C there, the more likely fish kill events are to happen. And I'll draw your attention to the southern latitudes here where that change was most dramatic. That's where we would expect the water temperatures to rise the fastest and really put that thermal stress on the fish populations that are present in those locations. So between the Minnesota paper and this one, we've established that there are indeed a lot of fish kills that are happening in the landscape, that they are predictable and driven, at least in part, directly or indirectly by water temperature increases. So as these papers came out, the two teams found each other, and we decided to combine data sets to see if we could provide a more robust analysis with more data, the better type approach. Now, I will emphasize that the next few slides are a work in progress. We're actively doing this right now, and conversations to be had about the nature of the data that will be presented, but I'll share them with you here with this caveat that they're preliminary and maybe subject to change. So putting it all on one map, you can see here just visually where these fish kill events are happening over this 10-year period. And I should point out that we combined the data sets and standardize them. So they were over the same time period of 2003 to 2013. They were similar types of lake criteria. The causes of mortality were equally defined across data sets. So we merged the data sets in a way that allowed for cross comparisons. And the reasons for the different colored dots here, you can see in this panel for the cause of mortality, dominated by infectious disease, largely columnaris, an indirect, perhaps an indirect result of warm water in the summertime. Now, this is a cool figure, and I'll orient you here before I start pulling some panels away. But on the right-hand, on the y-axis, it's the difference between the maximum surface water temperature and the critical thermal max of the various fish families. So it's the deviation from their thermal max that is important, and we wanted to understand if that might be a driver for the fish kill event directly. This sort of gets to that direct question. Now, on the bottom, on the x-axis, you can see the various fish families that were included in the mortality events with the CT max indicated from blue to red, and the temperature underneath is an average for that family. For the colder water species, the mortality events were happening when the temperature of the lake exceeded their thermal max. So we would assume here that this is a direct cause. The water temperature was just too hot for them to survive, and the fish died. For the warmer water species who can tolerate a fairly high water temperature, the water itself wasn't exceeding that thermal max very often, but that warm water could definitely contribute to indirect causes of mortality like low dissolved oxygen, algae blooms, and infectious disease. And that holds true when you look at the data. The infectious disease is much more common in species like centrarchids than they are on the other end of the thermal spectrum. And interestingly, here in the middle, you have Persidae, and this is a nice little curve here from cold to warm, and the influence where perhaps Persidae are sort of stuck in that middle and could be subjected to both direct and indirect impacts. We also looked at predicting future events, both for air and water temperature. You can see on the left-hand side the time periods that we looked at for past and future scenarios, and the data that was used to inform the temperature models. On the bottom of the figure, you can see time going across the x-axis, and the darker the reds and blues indicates increasing temperature over time for both air and water. You can see in the early 21st century, this is our baseline, this is what we know happened. And as we move forward, you can see that there are significant increases in the number of fish kills that we would expect to happen, and also importantly, some strong deviations between air and water models. That's important to consider as managers and what might be driving things in the future. More water temperature might be more tempered and not subjected to as strong of sort of daily weather swings as the air temperature is. And you can see differences spatially where air and water temperature models disagree with each other as the driving factor. And spatially, you can see similar to what they showed in the Till paper for the Wisconsin approach, those lower latitudes in southern Minnesota and Wisconsin have the biggest influence in the future on fish kills. So that's where we would expect to see water temperatures rising faster, and we would expect then to see more fish kill events happening. So those are some preliminary slides from this combined data set. We got a lot more cool stuff that I think will be coming out shortly here, but I just wanted to preview that for you. And come back to this question that I asked in the beginning of how will global climate change impact the health of fish in Midwest glacial lakes? Now, I think hopefully I've shown you that the increasing temperatures are going to directly and indirectly cause more fish kills in the future. And that these patterns that we've observed from the retrospective analyses and likely going forward are at least somewhat predictable in their location and the species and the other environmental conditions where these fish kill events take place. If we can understand these things, it informs the way we might approach management decisions in the future to support fish populations under changing climates. Now, I'll head off a likely question in the at the end here. What we haven't done yet is look at what sort of impact these mortality events might have at the population level. Are they going to be so severe that populations crash or that they shift because of the mortality? We would expect, as we see these mortality events, what often happens is highly fecund species like we have in this region rebound pretty quick, and the population level declines aren't long lasting. But as these thermal pressures hit the fish from multiple directions, that sort of rebound may become harder and harder to do. So it's speculative, but I would suspect that as lakes warm, these populations will become increasingly challenged. In fish health disease, these indirect causes are likely going to be contributing factors. If we've learned anything though, or if you take anything away from this talk, please know that there are going to be more fish kills. And I just have a few more slides here to wrap up with what you can do for those of you who want some action items as part of a presentation here. I'll first tell you what we've done in Minnesota to address improve our response to fish kills. And then I'll tell you a little more broadly what all of you could do. So in Minnesota, we've recognized that we need to advance our approach to fish kills, both the science and the management. So we worked with DNR to develop a standardized investigation manual. It's got reporting forms, protocols. Importantly, I think it's provides some differential diagnoses. So if you see this type of clinical symptom, here's what it could be. It sort of opens the door to possibilities other than collimaris or spawning stress, because there's a lot of other things that could be going on out there. And a notification list of if a fish kill happens, here's who you talk to, here's who you call. And that response tree is an assumed reality, I think. We don't often know who to call, especially when we need to do so fast. We also have these prepared fish kill response kits, like literally in my lab right now, there's this 2 totes where if somebody called me up and said we have a fish kill, I can just grab that box and go out in the field and do what we need to do. It's ready to go and we're not digging around on the spot. We developed training programs for a variety of audiences to build capacity in the field. We heard from local managers who are stretched thin the way it is, that they don't have time or the resources to get there fast. So we worked with veterinarians and aquaculture producers, students, to sort of build this network of individuals across the landscape. So if something happens in Bemidji or somewhere else in the state, we've got a local person who could respond quickly if others are busy. Because I've never been to a fish kill event where I haven't met somebody from the public. We have fact sheets, and the DNR, our pollution control agency, put together this postcard that's really helpful, that gives people an idea of what's going on out there as these fish kills occur. We also created a debate database. This is an online dashboard where anybody, the public or managers, could enter fish kill events. It asks about 10 simple questions that sort of alert the officials that something is going on. So for example, somebody submits a fish kill, I get an email right away that says that a fish kill is happening, and we can forward that on to who needs to be involved. And there's a website there if you want to check it out in more detail. So we haven't, I'll be totally honest with you though, we have not seen, at least from my vantage point, widespread increase in reporting. I told you that in Minnesota, at least, we have an estimated 500 events per year. We're not anywhere close to that. So I don't know exactly what the gap in information is here. If maybe it's too soon, maybe it's not a priority, there's mixed messages. There's quotes like this though that remind me that we still have some work to do. This came from a news report. The title of the news report was "What You Need to Know About Fish Kills." And you can read here the quote that was provided by the expert that they talked to. Essentially that fish kills weed out the weaker individuals so that only the strong survive. This idea that fish kills can be a good thing is a really mixed message in my opinion. And it runs contrary to sort of advancing this whole field of science. So for those of you not in Minnesota, or even those here, a few suggestions as you leave today. If you're a member of the public, you're a Lake Association person, you just like to be out in the water, if you see dead fish, I highly encourage you to contact your state or local natural resource office. They're the first contact, and time is of the essence. When I talk to the managers, their biggest concern is getting there quickly, and oftentimes they hear about these events days after they were first observed. And rotten fish is not really a lot of help from a diagnostic point of view. For the managers in the audience, I highly encourage you to document the details of these fish kill events. Even if you don't have time to get out and investigate, even if you don't think it's an important event as an individual case, in aggregation, as we put all of these fish kills together over time, we can start to see these important trends emerge. So I highly encourage you to do that. And if possible, pursue actual investigation of the events. And open the door too for sharing of data. If you have fish kill databases, please reach out to me or others part of this project team. We're very curious about expanding our approach to other places in the region or country where the data might be available. And for the academics in the crowd, there are a lot of outstanding questions as it relates to fish kills. As you pursue your research on fish populations or glacial lakes, please consider including fish health or fish kills as part of that work. It's an aspect that's often overlooked, and I think an important one. So that, Joe, will end, and if we've got plenty of time for questions if folks have them in the audience.
Thanks, Nick. Wow, that's really interesting stuff and a lot of food for thought for me, I know. So if you're in the audience, I recommend now that you now's the time to enter a question. We have some questions already, but remember, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. Take your mouse and hover it over the bottom of the screen. You'll see a Q&A button pop up. You can click that and enter your question. So with that said, I will get started on the question that we do have. Is there a fish kill database in Wisconsin, and where can folks find that, if so?
Yeah, good question. From what I understand, the Wisconsin DNR has a fish kill database. I do not know if it's publicly available though. So if you connect with the DNR folks over there, they'd probably point you in the right direction and either share that information or tell you or answer your questions about it.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Joe, I should point out too, the database that we created, our fish kill database, is not spatially restricted to Minnesota. If other folks in Wisconsin or Michigan or wherever want to contribute, I'm happy to add more users to it, and let whoever wants to have sort of back-end access to manage the data from those different states. I'm curious about what's happening here locally, but it's an open ArcGIS platform, so anybody could use it if they wanted to.
That's interesting. Did you guys create it that way intentionally, or was that sort of a post hoc thing that you realized the benefits, potential benefits?
Nope, it was in part intentional. There's expanding. When we first started creating it, there wasn't really an analogous system. There is now with Fish and Wildlife Service, they have a Whispers program where they're documenting events too, and their online interface has become much better, and you can report events there as well. So at the time, I thought I was filling a gap, but now we've got some federal programs too doing it.
Sort of a related question. We see a lot of citizen science monitoring programs for things like water quality, SecuDisc, that sort of stuff. Have you ever seen any efforts or attempts at citizen science monitoring aspects for fish kills?
Not formally. So we've done quite a bit of outreach to public groups and just getting the message out about reporting. So I think the message is getting across here pretty wide, but given the sort of sporadic nature and unpredictability, it's hard to have a core group of citizen scientists primed and ready to go to really do much more than reporting at this stage. There are really strong citizen science programs for mortality events related to birds and marine mammals. Those are huge programs out on the West Coast and down in Florida. And so they're leveraging that public interest to respond to those mortality events. We just haven't been able to replicate that here for fish in this region.
Interesting. Yeah, and of course, involving managers, as you said, was important for the diagnosis and some of those next steps.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. In your analysis, and I guess any of the analyses that you presented, were you taking lake depth into consideration?
So I don't believe so. Definitely not for the Minnesota data set. I don't believe it was lake depth was accounted for in the Wisconsin approach. The idea, though, that lake depth and thermal squeeze in warm summer temperatures, that's one of those indirect factors of rising temps. So it's likely playing out an important thing to look at.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Next question. Do you have any insight into winter fish kills? Some of the causes that you saw there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I glossed over that part. In the Wisconsin data set, they included winter fish kills as part of theirs. And it was, if I recall correctly, about 20% of the data was, 15% was attributed to winter kills. In Minnesota, we have a whole separate database that does winter kills. And we did not include that in our data set. So that doesn't really rise to didn't really come out in our approach. We would expect, though, that there's likely something going on there with changes in snowfall and ice cover and all that. It definitely deserves more attention.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of interesting hypotheses there that would be interesting to test. Next question. Has there been any correlation between summer fish kills and herbicide treatments or other aquatic vegetation management?
Not really as part of this study, and I don't believe so in like aggregate. There's one-off reports of toxicity associated with herbicide treatments or overspray from a farm field or something killing fish. But those are often one-off events that get reported, and understanding those patterns or trends hasn't really been looked at, no.
Have you heard any anecdotes about DO sags as a result of the reduction in biomass, living biomass from those plants?
Anecdotes, yes, but the data is often poor surrounding that. So, there's not many people out there with the DO meter following those things to really know. So you get these sort of causation correlation questions that emerge when you look at these data sets retrospectively. I think there's a lot of work that could be done prospectively with data collection. So if a fish kill happens, here are the types of things you look for, like let's check DEO, instead of just making a guess because it's hot out or because they did an herbicide treatment. Yeah, there's a lot of data to be gathered there.
Definitely. Let's see, I am not seeing any additional questions on the Q&A function, so I'll give everyone one last chance, last call for questions. Oh, I think we got a couple more here. How should people collect water temperature data before and after a fish kill? Is there a standardized method so that comparisons can be made over time and between lakes?
All right, so if I understood the question correctly, the water temperature data that's being used here is coming from modeled temperature data from Winslow paper, but getting actual on the ground measurements could be really valuable to ground truth some of that. It would be pretty unlikely to get pre-fish kill temperature data. So you're just guessing what's happening out there, but during a fish kill event would be really important. After the fish have already died, given the temperature fluctuations, you're probably not catching what was actually causing the mortality. It's like you see a bunch of dead fish, you go out the next day with a DO meter and a thermometer, and you're measuring what happened afterwards, not what caused the kill. So it's really, it sort of gets to that unpredictability of these events and sort of the challenge of collecting data. I think it's important knowing that people are prepared to respond more quickly. So you can get out there as fish are dying. If you're seeing moribund fish like swimming around or just starting to wash up fresh, that's when you want to be collecting those samples.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also gets to the benefits of long-term monitoring and understanding what's going on in those systems on a daily or monthly or yearly basis, maybe prior to that fish kill event. Okay, next question is kind of a long one. So many members of the public are not satisfied or remain suspicious about chemical causes when we evaluate a fish kill and declare it an environmental cause like low DO or high temps. And they wonder if water is safe for swimming after a fish kill. Do you have any suggestions on getting through to the public that it's usually not someone dumping old barrels in the middle of the night that leads to the fish kill? For example, these compiled data that you showed are great to show that a large percentage of reported kills are attributed to other causes. An expansion of these data sets for the Midwest and other states should be a priority.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. So there, people, and this is an interesting dilemma or interesting conversation that I often find myself in. So on one side, you have a concerned public who is really worried about the person who used like some chemicals to treat the plants in front of their property, and they must have oversprayed and must have killed everything in the lake. On the other end of that spectrum, and perhaps to address those concerns, you have managers who sometimes will characterize these events as natural or normal or a good thing. And so both ends of the spectrum aren't really helping, I don't think, advance what we really need to be doing. Understanding that there are human factors that are driving these events, not chemical necessarily, but nevertheless caused by people. And there are things that we could or should be doing to help, I think is an important message to get through to the public. Writing them off as like going too far in the other way, that these are just natural events and you shouldn't care about it. It's not chemicals, just don't worry. I think does a disservice to the problem and sort of lets people off the hook. And I don't think we need to be doing that. I think the public, if, I'm an educator, so I believe that we can teach people this stuff, but maybe it's not totally fair and the managers can tell me it's not true. But if we sort of bring both sides together in the middle, I'm optimistic that we can start to work and solve these problems instead of just argue in both directions. Yeah, the point is well taken, and I hear that a lot. And it's definitely a rare case where it's a chemical spill of some variety.
Yeah. There's a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
Okay. Just a question. Can you go back to the pie chart that shows the percentage of fish kills? Maybe if there's a particular question about that chart, the person who asked the question can ask it now.
Assume you're talking about this one. This is for the Wisconsin data set in the sort of the identified causes of mortality that were in that database. Yes, I misspoke earlier. It's 25% were attributed to winter kill, not 20 to 15.
All right, I don't see any follow-up questions. So now I will say I see no additional questions in the Q&A function. So this is our last call for questions. And while we have that last call hanging out there, I do want to again take time to thank you, Dr. Phelps, for doing this presentation. Clearly, it was very well attended. There's a lot of interest in this subject, and I found it really informative myself. I think that others did as well. So a huge thank you. You know, if we were in person right now, we'd be giving you a round of applause. You'll have to take my word for it that we have quite a few people on this webinar that would be applauding you if we turned their mics on. So
thanks a lot for the questions and discussion. And if you have any beyond right now, my email was at the end there. Hopefully you can follow up later.
Sounds good. Okay, I see no additional questions. So at this point, we'll wrap up. A reminder that the MGOP will email out a link to this webinar for those that registered to it, to attend it, maybe if you missed it or had a technical issue or anything like that. So we'll be sending that out within about a week. We encourage you to check out future webinars on the docket for the rest of this calendar year. Check out our newsletter and check out our forthcoming grant opportunity. With that, thank you all and have a good day.